On the 23rd floor of the Manhattan Federal Courthouse, one of the most humiliating moments in American legal history was about to unfold. The marble hallways echoed with the footsteps of reporters, legal observers, and court staff who had gathered for what they thought would be just another routine hearing in the endless stream of Trump-related litigation. But what happened in courtroom 23A that Tuesday morning would send shockwaves through the legal community, break the internet, and become a masterclass in how federal judges maintain the dignity of American courts when faced with unprecedented unprofessionalism. Trump's lead attorney, James Mitchell, strutted into the courthouse like he was entering a campaign rally, waving to cameras, flashing that confident smile that had made him a favorite on Fox News, and carrying himself with the swagger of someone who believed his media appearances had prepared him for the hallowed halls of federal court. He had no idea he was about to face Judge Sarah Netburn, a legal legend with 30 years of federal court experience, who had just witnessed the most disrespectful entrance in her distinguished career. What Judge Netburn said in the next 45 seconds didn't just destroy Mitchell's argument. It dismantled Trump's entire legal strategy and reminded America what real authority looks like. But before we dive into this incredible story, hit that like button and subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of institutional respect and professional competence that we need to see more of in America. Trust me, you won't want to miss how a true legal professional handles someone who confuses a courtroom with a TV studio. To understand the magnitude of what happened that day, you need to know who these two people really were and why this confrontation mattered so much to the integrity of the American legal system. Judge Sarah Netburn represents everything that's right about the federal judiciary. Appointed to the Southern District of New York in 1994, she had spent 3 decades building a reputation as one of the most respected federal magistrate judges in the country. Her legal mind was razor sharp, her courtroom management flawless, and her commitment to constitutional principles unwavering. Born in Brooklyn to a middle-class family, Netburn had worked her way through law school, clerked for a Supreme Court justice, and spent years in both prosecution and private practice before accepting her appointment to the federal bench. She had presided over some of the most complex and high-profile cases in New York, always maintaining the dignity and decorum that federal courts demanded. Judge Netburn's courtroom was known throughout the legal community for its professionalism. Lawyers prepared meticulously for appearances before her, knowing that she had read every brief, understood every legal precedent, and expected the same level of preparation from the attorneys who appeared before her. She didn't tolerate grandstanding, she didn't allow political theater, and she certainly didn't permit anyone to treat her courtroom like anything other than a temple of justice. In her 30 years on the bench, Judge Netburn had seen every type of lawyer imaginable. She had dealt with inexperienced attorneys, overly aggressive prosecutors, and even a few who had tried to turn her courtroom into a circus. But she had never encountered anything like James Mitchell. Mitchell represented everything that was wrong with Trump's approach to the legal system. A former cable news host who had gone to a third-tier law school and spent most of his career chasing media attention rather than mastering legal craft, Mitchell had been chosen for Trump's legal team not because of his courtroom skills, but because of his ability to spin complex legal issues into television soundbites. His background was in entertainment law and media consulting, not federal litigation. While Judge Netburn had been building a reputation for legal excellence, Mitchell had been building a brand around being a combative presence on television. He was used to environments where the loudest voice won, where interruption was considered strength, and where complex constitutional issues could be reduced to 30-second talking points. The case that brought them together was typical of the legal chaos that surrounded Trump's post-presidency. Federal prosecutors were seeking documents related to classified material handling, and Trump's legal team was fighting the request with a strategy that seemed designed more for cable news than for constitutional law. Mitchell had been sent to argue for executive privilege, a legal concept that requires nuanced understanding of separation of powers, historical precedent, and constitutional interpretation. But his preparation seemed to consist mainly of talking points that worked well on Fox News, but had little relationship to actual legal doctrine. The morning of the hearing, Mitchell arrived at the courthouse like he was arriving at a television studio. He spent 20 minutes outside giving impromptu interviews to gathered reporters, making statements about the case that any experienced federal court attorney would know could prejudice the proceedings. "This is just another witch hunt," he told CNN's cameras. "The president's rights are being violated, and we're going to show that today." He posed for photos, signed autographs for Trump supporters who had gathered outside, and generally conducted himself like someone who was more interested in the media coverage than the legal proceedings. Inside the courthouse, court staff were already shaking their heads. Federal court protocol is clear about attorney behavior, and Mitchell's pre-hearing media circus was exactly the kind of unprofessional conduct that judges deplore. But Judge Netburn, ever the professional, would let his conduct in her courtroom speak for itself. When Mitchell finally entered courtroom 23A, 15 minutes late, he brought with him an entourage that looked more like a campaign staff than a legal team. There were media consultants, political advisors, and even a documentary crew that he had somehow gotten permission to bring into the federal courthouse. Judge Netburn watched this circus enter her courtroom with the calm demeanor of someone who had seen enough in 30 years to remain unruffled by almost anything. But court observers later said they could see something shift in her expression, not anger, but the kind of steely determination that comes when a guardian of institutional integrity realizes that someone needs to be reminded of where they are and what that place represents. Mitchell approached the lectern with the confident swagger of someone who had never faced a federal judge who actually understood both the law and her role in protecting it. He shuffled through his papers, checked his phone one more time, and then looked up at Judge Netburn with what he probably thought was a winning smile. "Your Honor," he began, his voice carrying that familiar television cadence that worked so well for cable news segments. "We're here today because the deep state continues its relentless persecution of President Trump." Judge Netburn's gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. The sound was so unexpected and so authoritative that Mitchell actually took a step backward. "Mr. Mitchell," Judge Netburn said, her voice carrying 30 years of federal court authority, "I'm going to stop you right there." The courtroom fell silent. Even the court reporter paused, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "This is a federal courtroom, not a campaign rally. We will conduct these proceedings according to federal rules of civil procedure, constitutional law, and basic professional decorum. We will not be using political talking points, campaign slogans, or cable news catchphrases." Mitchell tried to interject. "But, Your Honor, the political nature of this persecution—" The gavel came down again, harder this time. "Mr. Mitchell, let me be absolutely clear about something. I have been a federal magistrate judge for 30 years. In that time, I have presided over cases involving organized crime, terrorism, corporate fraud, and every other type of federal matter you can imagine. I have never, and I mean never, had an attorney walk into my courtroom and attempt to turn federal judicial proceedings into a political theater." She leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on the tone of someone who was about to deliver a lesson that would be remembered long after the hearing ended. "You seem to be operating under the misapprehension that this courtroom functions like a television studio, where the loudest voice wins and where complex legal issues can be resolved through sound bites and political rhetoric. Let me disabuse you of that notion immediately." Mitchell stood there, his mouth slightly open, clearly unprepared for this level of pushback. On television, he was used to being able to interrupt, deflect, and overwhelm his opponents with volume and aggression. But in Judge Netburn's courtroom, he was discovering that 30 years of federal court experience trumped any amount of media training. "Your client is not President Trump in my courtroom, Mr. Mitchell. He is a private citizen who is subject to the same laws as every other American. This court does not recognize political titles for private citizens, and we certainly do not allow those titles to be used as shields against legitimate legal proceedings." The impact of these words was immediate and devastating. Mitchell had built his entire argument around the premise that Trump's former presidential status gave him special protections that ordinary citizens didn't have. But Judge Netburn had just stripped away that foundation with surgical precision. "Furthermore," Judge Netburn continued, "your characterization of these proceedings as persecution is not only inappropriate, it's insulting to this court and to the federal judicial system as a whole. These proceedings exist because federal law enforcement officials, operating within their constitutional authority, have requested documents that they believe are relevant to an ongoing investigation. She picked up a thick folder from her desk, clearly the case file, which she had obviously studied thoroughly. "I have reviewed the government's motion, Mr. Mitchell. I have examined the legal precedents they cite. I have considered the constitutional questions they raise. Their request is legally sound, properly formatted, and well within the bounds of established federal law." Mitchell tried again to speak, but Judge Netburn held up her hand with the authority of someone who had spent 3 decades managing courtrooms. "I have also reviewed your client's response, Mr. Mitchell, and I must say, in 30 years on this bench, I have rarely seen a legal document that contains so many factual errors, procedural misunderstandings, and constitutional misinterpretations." The courtroom was dead silent now. Even the court stenographer seemed to be typing more quietly, as if afraid to break the spell of this judicial masterclass. "Your brief claims executive privilege without demonstrating any understanding of how that privilege actually works under federal law. You cite cases that actually contradict your position. You make constitutional arguments that were rejected by the Supreme Court decades ago." Judge Netburn opened the brief and began reading directly from it, her voice dripping with the kind of professional disdain that only comes from someone who has spent their career mastering their craft. "You argue, and I quote, the president's absolute right to confidentiality supersedes any congressional or judicial oversight. Mr. Mitchell, this statement demonstrates such a fundamental misunderstanding of separation of powers that I'm genuinely concerned about your preparation for this hearing." Mitchell's face was turning red now. The confident swagger he had carried into the courtroom was completely gone, replaced by the deer-in-headlights expression of someone who was realizing they were completely out of their depth. The Supreme Court settled the question of absolute executive privilege in United States v. Nixon in 1974. They ruled, unanimously, Mr. Mitchell, that no person, not even the president, is above the law. They ruled that executive privilege cannot be used to withhold evidence in criminal proceedings. These are not obscure legal principles, Mr. Mitchell. This is fundamental constitutional law that any attorney practicing in federal court should understand. She set down the brief and looked directly at Mitchell with the expression of a teacher who was about to deliver a lesson that the student would never forget. "But even more concerning than your legal errors, Mr. Mitchell, is your apparent belief that you can walk into a federal courtroom and conduct yourself like you're appearing on a cable news program." Judge Netburn gestured toward the entourage that Mitchell had brought with him. "You brought a documentary crew into a federal courthouse. You spent 20 minutes outside this building giving interviews that could prejudice these proceedings. You arrived 15 minutes late to a federal court hearing, and you began your argument with political talking points rather than legal reasoning." The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Mitchell stood there, sweat beginning to show on his forehead, clearly unable to formulate any kind of response. "Mr. Mitchell, I want you to understand something very clearly. This courtroom represents 250 years of American judicial tradition. It represents the rule of law, constitutional government, and the principle that no person, no matter how wealthy, how famous, or how powerful, is above the law." Her voice was rising now, not with anger, but with the passion of someone who had dedicated her life to protecting the integrity of American institutions. "When you walk into this courtroom, you are not entering a television studio. You are not entering a campaign event. You are entering a temple of justice where the Constitution is not a political document to be manipulated for partisan advantage, but a sacred covenant that defines what it means to be American." Mitchell tried one more time to speak. "Your Honor, if I may just—" "No, Mr. Mitchell, you may not." Judge Netburn's voice carried the finality of 30 years of federal court authority. "You have demonstrated today that you are either unwilling or unable to conduct yourself with the professionalism that federal court proceedings require." She picked up another document from her desk, clearly a prepared order. "I am denying your motion for executive privilege. Your legal arguments are without merit, your constitutional interpretations are incorrect, and your understanding of federal law is insufficient for proceedings of this magnitude." The impact of these words was immediate and devastating. Not only had Mitchell lost the legal argument, he had been publicly dressed down by one of the most respected federal judges in the country. "Furthermore," Judge Netburn continued, "I am ordering your client to comply with the government's document request within 10 days. Failure to comply will result in sanctions that may include contempt of court proceedings. She looked directly at Mitchell, her expression stern but not unkind, more like a teacher who was disappointed in a student's performance but still hoped they might learn from their mistakes. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm going to give you some free advice that will serve you well if you continue to practice in federal court. The Constitution is not a talking point. Federal law is not a campaign slogan, and this courtroom is not a place where you can substitute media training for legal competence." She leaned back in her chair, her demeanor shifting from stern teacher to experienced judge delivering a final verdict. "Your client's interests would be better served by attorneys who understand that practicing law requires actual knowledge of the law, not just the ability to sound confident on television." With that, Judge Netburn brought her gavel down one final time. "This hearing is adjourned." Mitchell stood there for a moment, clearly stunned by what had just happened. He gathered his papers with shaking hands, avoided eye contact with everyone in the courtroom, and walked out without saying another word. The aftermath was immediate and explosive. Within minutes of the hearing's conclusion, legal observers who had been in the courtroom were tweeting about what they had just witnessed. Videos of Judge Netburn's epic shutdown began circulating on social media before Mitchell had even left the building. The hashtag Judge Netburn Destroys began trending on Twitter within an hour. Legal scholars were calling it one of the most effective judicial smackdowns in recent memory. Constitutional law professors were already planning to use the transcript as a teaching tool for their students. But the response went far beyond just the legal community. Americans across the political spectrum were sharing the video and praising Judge Netburn for defending the integrity of federal courts. Even conservatives who supported Trump were acknowledging that Mitchell's performance had been embarrassing and that Judge Netburn's response had been entirely appropriate. Fox News, which had featured Mitchell as a regular guest, quietly stopped booking him for appearances. Other members of Trump's legal team began distancing themselves from Mitchell's approach. Legal experts across the political spectrum praised Judge Netburn for maintaining courtroom dignity in the face of unprecedented unprofessionalism. The New York Times ran an editorial titled, "When Judges Remember Their Role," praising Judge Netburn for demonstrating how federal courts should respond to attempts at political theater. The Washington Post's legal columnist wrote that the hearing should be required viewing for anyone who wanted to understand the difference between law and politics. Even international media coverage was extensive. The BBC ran a segment on how American federal judges maintain institutional integrity. Legal experts in other countries praised Judge Netburn's handling of the situation as an example of how independent judiciary functions in a democracy. For Mitchell, the consequences were swift and severe. Several clients dropped him within days of the hearing. Legal recruitment firms that had been considering him for partnership positions withdrew their offers. His media appearances, which had been his primary source of income, dried up almost overnight. But perhaps most significantly, the hearing had broader implications for Trump's legal strategy. Other federal judges began citing Judge Netburn's ruling in their own decisions. Her clear articulation of why executive privilege didn't apply to private citizens became legal precedent that would be used in courts across the country. The legal community rallied around Judge Netburn's defense of judicial integrity. Bar associations issued statements supporting her handling of the case. Law schools began incorporating the transcript into their curricula as an example of effective courtroom management. Young lawyers particularly embraced Judge Netburn as a role model for how to handle pressure and maintain professional standards. Her calm, authoritative response to Mitchell's unprofessionalism became a template for how legal professionals should conduct themselves when faced with attempts to politicize the law. The hearing also sparked broader conversations about the relationship between media and the legal system. Legal ethics professors used the case to discuss the dangers of attorneys who prioritize media attention over legal competence. Court administrators began developing stricter guidelines for media access to federal proceedings. Perhaps most importantly, Judge Netburn's handling of the case reminded Americans that their federal courts remained institutions of integrity, staffed by professionals who understood their role in protecting constitutional government. In an era when many institutions faced challenges to their credibility, Judge Netburn had demonstrated that the federal judiciary remained committed to the rule of law. As one constitutional law professor wrote in the Harvard Law Review, Judge Netburn didn't just shut down one unprepared attorney. She reminded all of us what it means when we say that America is a nation of laws, not men. She showed us what institutional integrity looks like when it's defended by someone who understands both the law and her role in protecting it. The lesson was clear. In America's federal courts, the Constitution matters more than politics, legal competence matters more than media skills, and professional integrity matters more than partisan loyalty. Sometimes it takes a federal judge with 30 years of experience to remind everyone, including lawyers who should know better, what that really means. If this story inspired you like it inspired millions of Americans who believe in the rule of law, make sure to hit that subscribe button and share this video with everyone who needs to see what real judicial authority looks like. This is exactly the kind of institutional integrity and professional competence that makes America's legal system the envy of the world. Let us know in the comments what you thought of Judge Netburn's incredible response. And don't forget to check out our other videos about the real heroes who are defending American institutions. The lesson was unforgettable. In America, the Constitution isn't a prop for political theater. It's the foundation of everything we are. And sometimes it takes a federal judge who truly understands that principle to remind the rest of us what respect for the law really looks like. Disclaimer: this story is entirely fictional and created for entertainment purposes only. All events, conversations, and scenarios depicted are completely imaginary. Any resemblance to real people, events, or situations is purely coincidental. This content does not represent actual news or factual reporting.